They develop what you might call a kind of inner radar, an immediate sensitivity to deception that operates almost instantaneously. And I'm not talking about some mystical power or supernatural ability. I'm talking about something far more natural, far more grounded in the actual functioning of consciousness itself. Most people think that detecting deception requires careful analysis, logical thinking, checking the facts, comparing stories. And certainly those things have their place. But what I'm talking about operates at a different level entirely. It's more like the way you can instantly tell when a musical note is off key or when a painting's proportions are wrong. You don't need to analyze it. You simply perceive it directly. The question is, what exactly changes in awakening that makes this possible? Why can someone who has seen through their own illusions so readily perceive the illusions others are operating under? Let me start with a fundamental observation. Deception, whether it's conscious lying or unconscious self-delusion, always involves a kind of internal division. When someone is being deceptive, there's a split between what they're presenting and what actually is. There's a performance happening, a mask being worn, a story being told that doesn't quite match reality. And this split creates a certain quality of energy, a particular vibration, if you will, that the awakened person immediately recognizes. Now, why can they recognize it? Because they've become intimately familiar with that same quality in themselves. You see, the journey of awakening necessarily involves confronting your own deceptions, your own masks, your own self-delusions. You've had to see through the stories you tell yourself, the images you try to project, the ways you pretend to be something you're not. And once you've seen through your own game, you can't help but recognize when others are playing the same game. It's like this. Imagine you've spent years studying magic tricks, learning exactly how illusions are created, understanding all the techniques of misdirection and manipulation. Once you know how it's done, you can watch another magician perform and immediately see through the trick. Not because you're analyzing it intellectually, but because you recognize the pattern, the setup, the telltale signs that precede the illusion. The awakened person has done this with the ultimate magic trick, the illusion of the separate self, the ego. They've seen how it's constructed, how it maintains itself, how it creates elaborate stories to justify its existence, and because they've seen through their own ego's deceptions, they can immediately spot when another ego is engaged in the same kind of deception. But there's something even more fundamental happening here. When you awaken, you become established in what we might call simple presence, pure awareness, consciousness, without the constant overlay of judgment, interpretation, and narrative. And from this place of simple presence, you perceive things as they actually are, without the distorting lens of your own agenda, your own fears, your own desires. Most people don't perceive reality directly. They perceive their thoughts about reality. They see everything through a thick filter of beliefs, expectations, hopes, and fears. Someone says something to them, and before they've even fully heard it, their mind is already interpreting it, judging it, fitting it into their existing narrative about that person, about themselves, about the world. But the awakened person has learned to rest in that space before interpretation. They can hear something without immediately running it through their mental machinery. They can observe without immediately categorizing. They can be present to what is without instantly overlaying it with what they think it means. And in that direct perception, deception becomes obvious because deception is always a departure from what simply is. Let me give you a concrete example. When someone is lying to you, there's almost always a subtle incongruence between their words and their energy. The words might say one thing, but their body language, their tone of voice, the look in their eyes, something is slightly off. Most people miss this because they're listening to the words while filtering them through their own projections. They're thinking, do I want to believe this? Does this fit my hopes? Does this threaten my fears? And in all that mental noise, they miss the simple, direct perception of what's actually happening. The awakened person, however, is quiet inside. They're not running all that internal commentary. So they can perceive the whole gestalt of the communication, the words and the energy and the body language and the context all at once. And if there's an incongruence, they see it immediately. Not because they're looking for it, but because it simply stands out against the background of clear awareness. This is why you can't really fool someone who's genuinely awake. Not because they're suspicious or paranoid. Quite the opposite. It's because they're so present, so aware, so free from their own agendas that they simply see what's there. And what's there, when someone is being deceptive, always contains that telltale quality of internal division, of performance, of something being hidden or distorted. Now, let me be very clear about something. This capacity to spot deception is not the same as being judgmental or cynical. In fact, cynicism is actually a barrier to clear perception. The cynic expects deception, assumes the worst, and therefore sees deception even where it isn't. They're filtering reality through their own belief that everyone is dishonest, and that filter actually prevents them from seeing things as they are. The awakened person, on the other hand, has no such filter. They don't expect deception, but they're not naive either. They simply perceive what's there. If someone is being genuine, they see that. If someone is being deceptive, they see that too. There's no overlay of judgment about whether deception should or shouldn't be happening. There's simply clear seeing of what is. And here's something interesting. When an awakened person spots deception, they often don't make a big deal about it. They don't need to expose it, prove it, make the other person wrong. They simply see it and adjust their understanding accordingly. They recognize that the person is operating from their own confusion, their own fear, their own patterns, and they have compassion for that even while seeing through it clearly. This is very different from how most people relate to deception. Most people, when they think they've spotted a lie, become reactive. They feel betrayed, angry, righteous. They want to confront, to expose, to punish. But all of that reaction is coming from their own ego, which feels threatened or insulted by the deception. The awakened person's ego isn't running the show anymore, so there's no need for all that drama. There's simply clear seeing and appropriate response. Let me tell you about another aspect of this capacity. The awakened person can spot not just conscious deception, but unconscious self-deception. And this is actually far more common and far more interesting. Most people aren't consciously lying most of the time. What they're doing is believing their own stories, their own rationalizations, their own carefully constructed self-image. They're deceiving themselves and then expressing that self-deception outward. For instance, someone might believe they're acting from love when they're actually acting from fear. Or they might believe they're being generous when they're actually trying to control. Or they might believe they're seeking truth when they're actually just reinforcing their existing beliefs. These kinds of self-deceptions are everywhere, and most people never see through them because to do so would threaten their entire self-concept. But the awakened person has already dismantled their own self-concept. They've already seen through their own rationalizations and self-justifications. So when they encounter someone else's self-deception, they recognize it instantly, not because they're judging it, but because they know the territory. They've been there themselves. There's a particular quality to self-deception that's quite distinct. It has a kind of brittle rigidity to it, a defensiveness, an unwillingness to look directly at certain things. When someone is caught in self-deception, they can't afford to be truly open or flexible because that might allow reality to seep in and shatter their carefully maintained illusion. So there's always a quality of guardedness, of protecting something, of keeping certain areas off limits to examination. The awakened person feels this immediately. They're like a tuning fork that resonates to authenticity and goes silent in the presence of pretense. They don't need to think about it or analyze it. They simply feel the difference between someone who is available to reality and someone who is defending against it. Now, I want to talk about something that might seem paradoxical. The awakened person can spot deception instantly, yes, but they also recognize that deception itself is not the problem. The problem is being caught in deception, believing it, being unable to see through it. Deception, like everything else in human experience, is just part of the dance, part of the play of consciousness. In fact, the awakened person recognizes that they themselves still engage in certain forms of conventional deception. They might not tell someone the whole truth if it would be hurtful or inappropriate. They might play along with social conventions that involve a certain amount of pretense. The difference is that they're conscious of it. They're not fooled by their own performance. They know when they're wearing a mask and why, and they can take it off whenever they choose. This is a crucial distinction. Most people are unconscious of their own masks. They think the mask is their face. They identify completely with their performance. But the awakened person knows they're performing, knows they're wearing masks, and there's a lightness to it, a sense of play rather than desperate necessity. Let me give you another angle on this. One of the things that happens in awakening is that you become exquisitely sensitive to energy. Not in some mystical sense, but in the simple sense of being aware of the quality of presence that people bring. Every human being has a certain quality of energy, a certain vibration, a certain frequency they operate at, and this energy is always honest, even when their words aren't. You can feel, for instance, when someone is genuinely at peace versus when they're faking tranquility. You can feel when someone is authentically confident versus when they're compensating for insecurity. You can feel when someone is truly present versus when they're distracted or disconnected. These aren't things you think about. They're things you simply perceive directly, the way you perceive temperature or taste. The unawakened person is generally too caught up in their own energetic turbulence to perceive others clearly. Their own anxiety, their own desires, their own fears create so much internal noise that they can't pick up on the subtle signals others are broadcasting. But the awakened person, established in inner silence, inner stillness, can perceive these energies clearly. And when someone's energy doesn't match their words, when there's a discrepancy between what they're projecting and what they're actually emanating, it's immediately obvious. Here's another fascinating aspect. The awakened person can often sense deception not because of what someone is saying, but because of what they're not saying. There's a quality to omission, to strategic silence, to carefully avoided topics that creates a kind of energetic hole in the communication. The awakened person feels these blank spots immediately because their awareness is so comprehensive that absences are just as noticeable as presences. Most people only notice what's there. They listen to the words being spoken, the story being told, the information being shared. But the awakened person also notices what isn't there, what's being carefully stepped around, what's being unconsciously avoided. And often, what's not being said is more revealing than what is. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds exhausting. If you can see everyone's deceptions all the time, doesn't that make life depressing? And the answer is no, quite the opposite. Because when you can see clearly, you can also choose how to respond. You're not being unconsciously manipulated. You're not being pulled into other people's dramas without awareness. You're free to engage or not engage, to participate or not participate, all with complete consciousness. Moreover, when you can see through deception clearly, you can also see through to what's underneath it. You can see the fear that's driving the lie, the insecurity that's fueling the pretense, the hurt that's hiding behind the mask. And seeing this, there's naturally compassion. Not a pitying kind of compassion, but a recognition that this person is suffering, that they're caught in their own web of confusion, that they're doing the best they can with the level of consciousness they currently have. There's also another layer to this worth exploring. The awakened person can spot deception in systems and structures, not just in individual people. They can see when institutions are operating on false premises, when ideologies are built on unexamined assumptions, when entire societies are maintaining collective delusions. Most people accept the official story, the conventional narrative, the way things are supposed to be. They don't look deeper because to do so might be uncomfortable or threatening. But the awakened person has already been through the discomfort of questioning everything about their own reality. So they're comfortable continuing to question, to probe, to look beneath the surface of collective stories, just as they've looked beneath the surface of their personal story. And what they see is that much of what passes for truth in society is actually agreed upon fiction. Money is valuable because we agree it is. Borders are real because we agree they are. Status matters because we agree it does. These are collective deceptions, useful fictions that allow society to function, but fictions nonetheless. The awakened person sees them as such. They can participate in these fictions when appropriate, but they're never fooled by them. This clarity extends to spiritual matters as well. The awakened person can spot spiritual deception, spiritual materialism, false teachers with remarkable ease. Why? Because they know what authentic awakening looks like, feels like, sounds like. They know it in themselves, so they can recognize it or the lack of it in others. There are many people who claim to be enlightened, who perform the role of spiritual teacher, who say all the right words and make all the right gestures, but who are actually operating from ego, from the desire for power or admiration or control. The unawakened spiritual seeker often can't tell the difference. They're impressed by the performance, the confidence, the charisma, the claims. But the genuinely awakened person sees right through it. Let me come back to something fundamental. The reason the awakened person can spot deception so readily is not ultimately about having a special power or developing a special skill. It's about the removal of obstruction. It's about the clearing away of the fog that normally clouds perception. When your own mind is not constantly generating illusions, you can see clearly when others are generating them. Ordinary consciousness is like a dirty window. You're looking at the world through layers of conditioning, belief, fear, desire, and you see those layers as much as or more than you see what's actually outside. Awakened consciousness is like a clean window. The layers have been wiped away, and you see what's there with remarkable clarity. This is why awakening is sometimes described as becoming like a child again, not in the sense of being naive or gullible, but in the sense of perceiving directly, without all the accumulated layers of interpretation. A child hasn't yet learned to deceive themselves, or to accept others' deceptions as normal. They see clearly until they're taught not to, until they're socialized into accepting the conventional lies that hold society together. The awakened person has unlearned that socialization. They've returned to direct perception, but now with the wisdom and understanding that the child lacks. They can see clearly and also understand what they're seeing. They can spot deception and also comprehend why the deception is happening, what purpose it's serving, what fear or desire is driving it. And here's the beautiful thing. As you become more established in clear seeing, as you become more familiar with the difference between authenticity and pretense, you naturally draw more authenticity into your life. Not because you're rejecting people who are deceptive, but because there's a natural resonance. Authentic people are drawn to authenticity. Truth resonates with truth. So, how do spiritually awake people spot deception instantly? They see it the same way you see colors or hear sounds. It's direct perception, unobstructed by their own agendas and illusions. They feel it in the quality of energy, the coherence or incoherence between words and presence. They sense it in what's not being said as much as what is. They recognize the patterns because they've seen through those same patterns in themselves. This capacity is not something you acquire as an achievement. It's something that's revealed when the obstructions are removed. It's your natural state of awareness, operating without the distortions of ego and fear. And it's available to anyone willing to look honestly at themselves, to question their own deceptions, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, to rest in simple presence. The path to this clarity is the path of self-honesty, of ruthless self-examination, of willingness to see your own masks and games and pretenses. And as you see through your own deceptions, as you become more established in simple authenticity, you naturally develop this capacity to see clearly when others are operating from deception. It's not a power you wield, it's a clarity you embody. And in that clarity, there's tremendous freedom, not just freedom from being deceived by others, but freedom from deceiving yourself. And that freedom is the greatest gift awakening offers, the ability to live in reality as it actually is, without the constant overlay of illusion. This is what it means to be awake, to see clearly, to live authentically, and to recognize immediately when you or others are departing